The air outside is cold, the wind biting as I reach the front door. I have been gone too long. The key slides in the lock. I could hear the bolt slide into its steel housing. With a few twists, the padlock opens as well. The door is sealed by a thin layer of ice from 2 months of blowing snow. I turn to my left and thrust my shoulder into the solid oak door. The cabin is no warmer inside. There is no sign of activity except for a few bits of yellow couch cushion and foam lying on the floor. A mouse must have snuck in while I was away, but he is either long gone or frozen solid, or I would have smelled its corpse before eyeing the mess it made. I usually come up at least once in the summer to check on the cabin, but has been so busy at work this year with the new system updates, I just couldn't get away. I built the cabin on the shore of Lake Winnetka in northeast Minnesota. I park my truck off Fernburg Road and head north along Beaver Creek. The cabin is 3 miles by foot. The hike is easier during the winter months because I can snowshoe the frozen creek and not bushwhack the bank. The cabin is completely off-grid. The closest neighbors are the Potawatomi that live on the tribal lands given to them 125 years ago when they run off their native lands along the west coast of Lake Michigan between what is now Milwaukee and Green Bay. Most people think about the Trail of Tears, which led many of the southwestern Indians west towards designated lands in Oklahoma. But Indians of all tribes were relocated. Many Great Lakes tribes were moved north and west of the Mississippi. I dropped my backpack and walked over to the stack of firewood and grabbed my grandfather's hatchet. The hatchet was old, passed down from my great-grandfather to my grandfather, then down to me. It hung from a square nail embedded in the pine log wall. The face of the hatchet was etched. Herders, Waseca, Minnesota. The handle was replaced once in the 1960s while my grandfather was finding any way to keep himself busy after finding out my father had died from friendly fire along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. My father was his only son. I was born 4 months later to an 18-year-old rest stop waitress. My mother gave me up to my grandparents when I was 4. She told me we were going to stay with my grandparents for a little while. When we got to the door, she rang the bell and told me that she was going to get our bags from the trunk. I never saw her again. She died from a heroin overdose when I was 12. The axe came down precisely, lopping off small pieces of kindling, which I put into the stove. The metal flue crackled as the heat escaped through its pipes. I walked outside and grabbed the Coleman cooler off the sled and brought it inside. My feet ached, but it wasn't warm enough to take my boots off. The A-framed cabin was small, roughly 10 by 8 feet. There was a bed on the second story which was accessed by a ladder I made from 2 small pine trees that grew outside the front porch. Because heat rises, I decided I would rest in the loft for a little while until the rest of the cabin was thoroughly warmed. Above my bed was a shelf. Some of my most prized possessions lived on that shelf. My eyes gazed upon those objects. A green hair tie, a small pocket knife with a monogram KLB, and a small silver mood ring. My mind began to wander as I looked over those objects. I started to think of Jessica. Jessica Tucker, the mailbox read. I missed her face. She lived in the apartment next to mine, apartment 2B. We lived across from one another for 6 months before I said hi. I was funny that way with women. I needed everything to align. It couldn't seem like I was desperate. Our eyes had to meet naturally before I introduced myself, otherwise I fear I'd come off creepy. One evening, I saw Jessica crying on her way upstairs. She wore a tight, white tank top and blue jean skirt that fell midway down her thigh. Around her neck was a small gold cross necklace. This was my chance, I thought. I asked her if she was all right. She lied. She said she was okay. There is something so sexually arousing when a woman cries. I remember going to bed that night and imagining how our relationship would go. Our first date would be a nice Italian dinner with wine and calamari to start. We would come back home and I would tell her I have to get to sleep early. I don't kiss on the first date, I would tell her. Girls love a guy that likes to wait. I would wait patiently for her to come over, growing more and more aroused by the idea by the minute. She wouldn't come. I would see her the next evening and she would be crying again. I was even more aroused at this point, and I went to the bathroom to jerk off. I climbed down the ladder and added another log to the stove. Each log burns maybe 45 minutes. The heat from the stove was drying out the air. I grabbed a pot from beneath the water basin. Walking outside, I bent down and scooped snow from the front yard into the pan. I moseyed back inside and placed the pot on the wood burner. The water would soon evaporate and humidity levels would be back to a tolerable level. I needed a drink. In the Coleman was a 6-pack of Dr. Pepper. Back home I rarely drink soda. I grabbed a can and took a butcher paper wrapped package marked JT and laid it on the counter. I popped the top and take a sip. Dr. Pepper reminds me of my neighbor growing up. Cute little Katie Bowman. Katie had strawberry blonde hair and green eyes. Her lips were pale pink and her nose was small and turned slightly up. She was really pretty, but boy was she mean. She used to call me Four Eyes and Twinkle Toes. Katie was a tomboy, always off playing in the woods, which is why no one suspected foul play when her 14-year-old body was found at the bottom of a drainage 100 yards behind Andy's towing. The coroner concluded that she had died from blunt force trauma to the left temple, which most likely was suffered falling onto the rocks at the bottom of the drainage. I would need more firewood for the week. I had cut down a tree 3 summers back, a large maple that had been hit by lightning. The maple held 3 cords of usable lumber, enough to last the cabin 9 winters. That was the same year I met Margaret. She was quite the free spirit. I met her on the ride up. She was hitchhiking on her way to Vancouver, she said. When she climbed in the cab, I noticed her slightly baggy jeans and brown dreadlock hair. The first white girl with dreads I ever met. She smelled like fresh-cut grass. Her hands were dirty from nights spent outside. "It's a nice ring," I said. "It was my mother's," she replied. It was getting late, and I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I reached for the skillet under the sink. A 12-inch antique lodge cast-iron pan. With a little care, these pans could last for generations. I oiled it before I left last winter, and it was still in well-seasoned condition. I placed the skillet on the stove to bring it up to temp. I liked my meat pan-seared. While the pan warmed, I took my pack upstairs. I took my shirt off and threw it onto the bed. My eyes glanced over at the green hair tie. It was Holly's. Holly was my first everything. She was so caring and tender. I reached my hand into the pack and grabbed for my flannel. As I pulled the arm out of the JanSport, the reason for my visit fell on the floor. I picked up the small gold cross necklace and placed it on the ledge above my bed, right next to Margot's ring. I picked up the small gold cross necklace and placed it on the ledge above my bed, right next to Margot's ring. I made my way back downstairs and grabbed the defrosted package from the counter. I unwrapped the 6-inch tenderloin from its package. The meat sizzled as it hit the pan. I had to be quick so the meat wouldn't stick. After browning all sides, I placed the meat on the paper plate. I didn't use utensils up here at the cabin. It was more primitive that way. This made for a more visceral experience. I grabbed the loin with both hands and brought the flesh to my face. I had been anticipating this moment for weeks. I sank my teeth into the muscle. Lukewarm blood ran down under my chin. The meat was saltier than I remembered, much gamier than beef and leaner than pork. With a full belly, I took a moment and gave thanks. Remembering Jessica's crying face once again made me sexually aroused. I went up to bed. Placing my trophies on my gorged belly, I jerked myself off, remembering their pleas.